Today we're going to learn how to compare decimals. To start, we need to understand really what is a tenth and what is a hundredth. We're going to start with tenth. A tenth is named such because it has that word 10 in it, and there are 10 tenths in one whole. So if I were looking at my grid down here, this bar right here is worth 1/10. Because if I had 10 of these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, they would cover up the whole square. Now these right here, these are written as tenths. This is 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, 5/10, 6/10, 7/10, 8/10, 9/10, and 10/10. And we learned that 10/10 is the same as one whole. Written as fractions is written 1/10 for 1/10, 2/10 for 2/10, 3/10 for 3/10, 4/10 for 4/10, and so on. So in your head you have to realize that a tenth is called a tenth because there are 10 of them in one whole. And when you visualize it, a tenth is worth 1 bar, 1 rod on the square. If we compare that to a hundredth is called such because there are 100 of them in a square. Now, I know you may be thinking, 100, that's bigger than 10, so a hundredth has to be bigger than 10, right? Try again. Because there are 100 of them in the square instead of just 10 of them in the square, this right here would be worth 1/100th. Notice how much smaller it is than the tenth. So if you think about it, if there are 100 of them in the same space that there's 10 of these, of course they have to be smaller. So this is 100th, this is 200th, this is 300th. This would be 2400th. That would mean that I would take 24 of these little squares and put them on the grid. This would be 6200th. I would put 62 of these squares on the grid. This is worth 70/100th and 80/100th. Again, I would have 70 or 80 of these little guys on the square. So 100th is this size. It is a small little square because there has to be 100 of them that fits in my big square. This right here would be 1/10. When I'm looking at it, the tenths are the first place value next to the decimal. Notice how there's only one number after that decimal. The hundredths are where there's 2 places afterward. So this is 300ths, this is 99/100ths. Now there's a helpful trick when you are comparing tenths to hundredths. We know that right here, this is 1/10. And we know that each one of these little squares is worth 100th. You could take a tenth and add a 0 on the end of it and it won't change anything. The reason is because if I take 1/10, written right here, and I put 10 hundredths next to it, it's worth the same amount. So 1/10 is the same as 10 hundredths. It doesn't matter if I add zeros on the end, it won't change anything. Same goes down here. 2/10 is the same as 20 hundredths. I just added a 0 on the end. 4/10, that's the same as 40 hundredths. 9/10, that's the same as 90 hundredths. I can add a 0 on the end and it won't change anything. So when you're comparing decimals, if 2 decimals are the same length, they're both tenths, or they're both hundredths, or they're both thousandths even, you can compare them just like normal, starting with the number closest to the decimal. If they aren't the same length, you can add a 0 to the end to make them the same length. So on this first one, I have 6/10 and 2/10. Since they're both tenths, I can compare them. My instruction says start with the one next to the decimal. So there's only one number next to the decimal. It's a 6 versus a 2. Obviously 6 is bigger than 2. So 6/10 is greater than 2/10. On this one I have 59 hundredths and 21 hundredths. They both have 2 digits after the decimal place. So they're both in the hundredths place value, so I can compare them like normal. Here I look at the one next to the decimal and it's a 5. The one next to the decimal here is a 2. Well, obviously 5 is bigger than 2. So 59 hundredths is greater than 21 hundredths. On this one, I have 9 hundredths and 11 hundredths. Even though this is a 0, it still counts as a digit. So since both of them are 2 digits long, they're both in the hundredths, I can compare like normal. The one right next to the decimal is a 0. The one right next to a decimal is a 1. So 11 hundredths is bigger than 9 hundredths, or 9 hundredths is less than 11 hundredths. Now this one we have a problem. I can see that there's 2 digits in this number, but only 1 digit in this number. I can use that trick of adding a 0 on the end to make it easier for me to be able to compare. So now I have 8 hundredths and 20 hundredths. Now I can see right next to the decimal place I have a 2 and a 0. The 2 is bigger, so 8 hundredths is going to be less than 20 hundredths. Here again I have another problem. I have 2 place values, but I only have 1 here. Can you remind me what it is I need to do? If you were thinking I needed to add a 0 to this number, you would be correct. I can add a 0 and it doesn't change anything at all. Now it's easy for me to compare 72 hundredths or 30 hundredths. Well, the 7 is the one right next to the decimal place, and it's bigger than the 3, which is right next to the decimal place. And I know that 72 is bigger than 30, so I know 72 hundredths is greater than 30 hundredths. Last but not least, I have that last problem again. 2 digits, 1 digit. This one's up to hundredths, and this one's to tenths. What can I do to solve my problem? If you thought I should add a 0 to the end, you would be correct. Now, it doesn't make sense for me to add a 0 here, then I'd have 3 and 1. So I need to add a 0 to the tenths and to make it a hundredths. Now I can compare 55 hundredths versus 50 hundredths. Both of them have a 5 right next to the decimal place, so I go to the next number. Here I have another 5, here I have a 0. Well, 5 beats 0, so 55 hundredths is going to be greater than 50 hundredths. Now, sometimes even adding zeros doesn't help. Sometimes you really just need to use a picture to help you to compare those decimals. We've learned how to draw pictures. We know that tenths are going to be those long sticks, and hundredths are going to be the little squares. If in doubt, you can always sketch a picture to see if there's something that will help you. So I can see that this is 5 tenths. I can see this is 23 hundredths. I can see this is 8 hundredths, and this is 8 tenths. Looking at the picture, it is obvious which one is going to be least or the smallest. This guy right here has very little colored in at all. So 8 hundredths is going to be the smallest one. Looking at the picture, I can also see which one is the biggest, the one that's colored in the most. 8 tenths has a ton colored in. So I know that 8 tenths is going to be the greatest or the biggest. Now I'm down to these last 2. Again, I can clearly see in the picture that 23 hundredths is less than 5 tenths. So using my picture, I know that the smallest one is 8 hundredths. The next smallest one is 23 hundredths. Then we go to 5 tenths, and the biggest one obviously is 8 tenths. Drawing pictures can be a great strategy to help you to make sure that you've compared them correctly. On my last one, it's time for you to practice. On a whiteboard, please compare all 4 decimals below. Put them in order from least, which is the smallest, to greatest, which is the biggest. Remember the strategies that we've learned about, how you can add zeros on the end, or how you can make them all hundredths by drawing pictures. Go ahead right now and pause the video, and on your whiteboard write which one is the smallest, the next smallest, nearly the biggest, and finally the biggest. Are you ready to check your work? Looking at these numbers, I see 27 hundredths, 6 tenths, 7 hundredths, and 55 hundredths. I'm going to use that strategy of adding zeros to the end. So I can add a 0 here, and now they're all in hundredths. Now it's easy for me to compare. 27 hundredths, 60 hundredths, 7 hundredths, or 55 hundredths. 7 hundredths is the smallest out of all of these, so I'm guessing that my smallest place value is going to be 7 hundredths. Now looking at the next ones, 27, 60, or 55. Well, 27 hundredths is smaller than 60 and 55 because the 2 is smaller than the 6 and the 5. So 27 hundredths would be the next smallest. The nearly biggest one would be the 65, because between 60/100ths and 55/100ths, the 6 is greater than the 5, so the 5 would be next. And last but not least, you can see out of all four of these numbers, the 60/100ths is going to be the greatest one, because that 6, the first number next to the decimal, is the biggest. Did you get the four numbers correct? Now you know some strategies in order to help you when comparing decimals. Remember, you can add zeros on the end to make them all hundredths, or you can draw pictures to help you as well. Go ahead and continue on with the next part of your center.